A leather wallet lay on the pavement like a small, deliberate lie. Slicked by rain, its grain dark and honest against the gray of the city. Emma Carter paused with her sneaker hovering over it, as if deciding whether to step into someone else's life or let the life drift into the gutter. The rain blurred the neon across the street into watercolor. The wallet's brass zipper caught a slant of light and winked, and for a breath she forgot everything else. Applications sent and unanswered, the stack of past due notices, the way her mother's voice had started to tremble on the phone the night before when she spoke about new test results. She crouched, the denim of her knees leaving damp marks on the sidewalk, and fished the wallet free. It was heavier than it looked. When Emma unzipped it, the bills were folded with practiced care. 2 envelopes of $50 bills, neat as if they had been counted by someone who treated money as a project. She laid a hand over them and felt the ache behind her ribs, the small, endless calculations a caretaker did in the morning before the world had teeth enough to bite back. $2,000. She had counted it twice, 3 times with the same trembling fingers. 2,000 could cover a month of medicine, an intake appointment with a specialist in the city, a short lease on an airier room that would give her mother space to breathe. She closed the wallet as if it were a breathing thing that needed respect, and let the rain keep pattering. Honesty, she had learned, did more than keep you clean. It kept dignity intact. Returning other people's property had been a habit since she was 12. Lost library cards, borrowed sweaters, a neighbor's tool set. This, though, felt different. This felt like fate or testing, like some cruel joke where the world offered her a ladder only to yank it away. Still, she could not fold herself into the shape of what desperation wanted. She walked toward the nearest building with a name she did not recognize at the time, Reed Innovations. The glass doors sighed as she pushed them open, and the noise of the rain became a softer thing, muffled by polished marble and the hum of controlled air. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and new carpet. Men and women in tailored coats passed like panels in someone else's life. Their umbrellas left dark pools at their feet. A potted plant leaned politely against the wall. Patricia Winters, who wore the kind of smile that worked like a well-trained dog, lifted her head behind the reception desk. Her hair was precisely set, her badge announced her name in neat type. She looked at Emma with a practiced, slight narrowing of the eyes used to rank people in the first 5 seconds. Company badge or not, suit or not, the way someone held themselves. "Can I help you?" Patricia asked. Emma felt the city bracing itself for embarrassment. She crossed the red carpet and put the wallet on the desk between them like an offering. Dark leather, a small brass zipper, a dampness at its edges. She watched the way Patricia's fingers hovered before picking it up, the way she checked the wallet for identification like a surgeon inspecting a sample. "Found this on 7th, Emma said. Her voice was small in the lobby's echo. "It belongs to someone who works here. She could have said, "I need you to know who it is," but she didn't want to be reduced to a plea. Returning it was a thing she could control. Patricia's eyebrows drew together in a practiced, professional way. "We have security protocol for lost property," she said. "You should give it to security." "I would like him to know it's been returned," Emma said. "To know that—" She stopped because the rest of the sentence had an edge of pleading she couldn't afford. He might be coming through. Patricia, the gatekeeper, made a small calculation. "You can wait. Please, sign a slip." She slid a clipboard across the desk. The lobby's hum swallowed the small scrape of pen. Emma scrawled her name and where she'd found the wallet. On the slip, she left a note. "Found on 7th Street, returned to reception." That was it, the smallest of records. A security officer took the wallet. He carried it with a certain respect, like a relic rather than a piece of someone's day. The months had taught Emma to watch how the city handled other people's property. Some treated it like an inconvenience, others like an artifact. The security doors opened again, and a man came through with the kind of presence you only noticed when it shifted the air. He was not loud, he did not need to be. He moved like an object of gravity, measured, inevitable. Alexander Reed watched her before he reached the desk. He was taller than she expected. Brown hair, flecked with gray at the temples, eyes that seemed to measure you like a lens measuring light. At 42, his face carried loss as if it were a second skin. Careful, guarded, practiced into a steady expression that was more a shield than charm. He wore a wool coat over a suit that suggested an industry of decisions. He took the wallet from the security officer with a hand that showed no tremor. "Miss Winters," he said, with a voice like a drawn bow. "Thank you." Patricia nodded and retreated like a wall folding in proper places. She watched Alex with something like reverence. He watched the receptionist with a patience that made you believe he had the time to measure everything. When her gaze flicked past him, it landed on Emma, and the tilt of the world changed. For a second, Alex's expression shifted, a small, almost invisible flicker of curiosity at the sight of a young woman who had returned his property instead of pocketing it. "You found this?" he asked, as if he were asking an inconvenient fact and not thanking a human. Emma lifted her chin a fraction. "Yes, sir, on 7th. "Thank you." He looked at her hands, the small scar along her knuckle, the dirt under a thumbnail from some day's work, and his eyes lingered where the wallet had been. "Thank you," he said again. He opened the wallet with careful fingers and counted the stack of bills. Emma watched his face flicker when he saw the neat, diminutive stack. 2,000, he said, almost to himself. She had not meant to stay. She had not meant to volunteer herself as a witness to his count. She had intended to leave the way anyone leaves small acts of honesty, quiet, unbragging. But something in the lobby made her feet glue to the floor. Some private muscle twitched, and she said, "You could have left it." He closed the wallet and stared at it for a long breath, as if evaluating more than currency. "I purposely drop things sometimes," he said, in a voice that folded the sentence into the lobby like a dropped pin. "Different places, different people. I've been studying honesty." The word landed, odd. Emma's mouth shaped itself around a laugh that turned to a thin cough. "You test strangers by losing things?" "Well," he said, not apologetic, "I observe." "Observe?" She heard the edge, the incredulity, the moral heat rising. "So when you drop this, you're not losing something? You're setting a trap?" Alex didn't seem offended by the extraction. He looked at her as if she had merely noted a detail in a weather report. "I wanted to see who would return it," he said, "and why. There are too many variables when you fund people. You want to know the person behind the pleadings." Emma tasted something bitter. "So you trick people and then, what, reward the ones you like? Make judgments about someone's life based on a moment you engineered?" He had the honesty of someone who had spent a long time alone with his decisions. "I'm not proud of how it's been done," he said, "but I wanted to know if people would look the other way when they had the choice." "That's not your choice to make," Emma said. Her voice had that low, steady heat that came from pretending not to care and failing. She stopped because the rest of the sentence explained something she had learned. Privilege got to define the world and call it research. Reed's hand was on the desk, and when he rested it there, she noticed the small scar along his knuckle, the careful precision of a man who moved things and people with measured force. "You were going to walk away," he said. "You put it back." "You would have taken it?" she asked. He studied her. "I would. And then?" "And then I would have had to decide whether to reward your honesty," he said again, like an experimenter filling a page in a notebook. Emma felt the blood move in a way that had nothing to do with the rain. "So you reward people by offering them work? By, what, giving them a job?" He was watching the way she reacted to the possibility. "We have opportunities at the foundation," Reed said, using the name with care. "Someone with your character might find the work meaningful. It pays well, benefits, and there are roles that don't require a college degree if someone demonstrates practical acuity." The word pay lodged like a splinter. Emma had learned to recognize the way money was offered like panacea, a salve that did not attend to underlying rot. She could have left. She could have said no to the whole scene and gone back to the walk-up where her mother's oxygen machine hummed. But she had come to return a wallet, not to be tested by a man who called it research. "I'm not interested in being a subject," she said. "If you're testing people's morality, you should be testing your methods." Reed's mouth tightened. "Fair," he said. "I'm not asking you to be a subject. I'm offering you a job." She almost laughed out loud at the bluntness of it, the way the offer tried to slide into an easy moral ledger. You did a good thing, here's a good thing in return. But Emma had spent enough nights counting bills to know that gratitude was not the same as justice. "I don't take charity," she said. "If this is charity, tell your security to leave the wallet on the curb." "It's not charity," Reed said. "It's a paid position on the foundation team. The salary is not token. The person would be an assistant to the executive office. Logistics, communications, event preparation. Good pay, benefits, plus training. And there are opportunities to work on community outreach. I can put you on a living wage from the start." She heard the practical math clanging in the words like coins. She saw a future that smoothed in increments, less worry about the rent and more time to breathe when her mother coughed, the possibility of finding a specialist who could give them a better plan. But the offer tasted of manipulation, of power folded into help like a hand inside a glove. "You expect something in return," she said. "I expect competence," he said, "and discretion." He paused. "And I expect, perhaps, that this time, when someone chooses honesty, I respond in kind." She almost had to walk out at that moment. The old Emma, the one who had learned to protect her dignity by refusing to be indebted to the charity of strangers, would have. But inside her, someone kept a ledger differently. Obligation to her mother, to herself. She pictured the small kitchen in their building, the way the radiator clanked, the receipts stacked like prayers, the way her mother's smile had gone thin with worry. She took out her phone and sat on the lobby bench while Reed and Patricia spoke in near whisper. The city hummed as if nothing had happened. There was a quiet moment where she imagined what accepting would mean. New clothes, a different commute, credentials that might keep insistent hands of bureaucracy from them. It would not fix everything. It would not erase the way the medical system treated them like a problem to be managed. But it might change the cadence of their days. She stood and met Reed's eyes. "If it's a job, I'll need to know the terms," she said. "Training, notice, pay, all of it in writing." "That's fair," he said. "We'll outline it. You'll be given 3 references for the position. Training begins right away if you wish. We could accommodate a start date as soon as you're ready." She had planned to say no. She had planned to protect what little pride she had by refusing to accept help from a man who treated honesty like an assay. But when she thought about her mother's inhaler, the emptiness in the medicine cabinet, she felt the world tilt toward a different option. The job would not be a handout. She would work. She would be paid for her labor. And perhaps working at the foundation would let her be more than a caretaker. Maybe she could return to photography in the hours between obligations. "I'll think about it," she said. Reed inclined his head, the motion more like a professional acknowledgement than a promise. "Think quickly," he said. "We could use someone who brings the kind of steadiness you just showed." On the way out the doors, the rain hit her face and cleaned her in a small way. The wallet's weight had been replaced by a different heaviness. She had not yet decided whether she would step into Reed's orbit. The city kept moving, indifferent and colossal. If you love character-driven stories, consider subscribing. There are more like this, small, imperfect lives that turn when fate nudges the edge. A single click helps me tell them. She walked the long block home, thinking about the careful folds of the $2,000, not for taking, but because they had been there, tidy and patient. She imagined the same money paying for a specialist's consultation, for a few bottles of medication, for a month of rent that would let them sleep without counting breaths. At the stoop of her building, Emma breathed in the hollow smell of wet trash and radiator steam and felt the city's skin press around her. Her mother opened the door before she could unlock it, hair in a messy bun, cardigan clinging to the shape of her shoulders. The house smelled like tea and antiseptic. Her mother's face tightened in a small way when she saw Emma's expression, patient as always, as if she had practiced for this, the look that asked without words whether the world had given them something better today. "Anything?" her mother asked, setting down a small paper bag with biscuits. Emma sat at the rickety table, the chair complaining under her weight. She could have told her the whole story, how she found a wallet, how she'd walked into Marble and Lemon and had been offered a job, how a man in a suit had told her he liked her honesty and would like to pay for it. She could have watched the expression flit across her mother's face, the cautious hope. But some forms of hope were fragile. They needed careful tending. "I might have a job," she said, the words both heavy and small. Her mother's hands stopped moving. "A job?" she repeated, voice thin with a mixture of relief and instinctive defense. "Where? What kind of job?" "At the Reed Foundation. Mr. Reed, Alex, found his wallet and offered me something." She watched the way her mother's eyebrows lifted, the way years of being careful had not hardened that vulnerability. It made Emma's throat ache. Telling the truth was a strange kind of mercy. Its complications would come later. Her mother set the biscuit aside. "Is it charity? Are they donating?" "It's a job," Emma said. "Paid. There's training. I'd be an assistant." "You sure?" Her mother's voice was steady now, the worry tempered with maternal calculation. "It could be good. It could be—" She reached out and laid a hand on Emma's, the skin thin and warm like paper. "If they pay enough, we can get that specialist." Emma wanted to tell her all the reasons she had hesitated. She wanted to tell her mother about Reed and his tests, the idea of being studied like an animal in a lab. She wanted to explain that she resented the implication that morality was conveniently measured by a dropped wallet. But saying it out loud made it sound like a luxury they could not currently afford. "Will you take it?" her mother asked. The question was simple as a coin. Emma felt the ledger inside her shuffle. Dignity, need, the calculation of what was owed now versus what could be hoped for later. She thought of the camera that had once been hers, the small second-hand Nikon that had collected dust on her shelf. Photography had been the one thing she kept when the world took almost everything else, a way to set distances right and make strangers into a frame. Working at a foundation would not be a gallery opening. It might, at least, purchase time, the crucial, malleable thing. "I will," she said. The decision did not dissolve the world's complexities. It rearranged them. She would work under a man who had staged tests and treated honesty as a curiosity. She would go into a place that smelled of lemon and power. But she would be paid, and with that payment, she could breathe a little easier. It was still a choice she had made, not something handed to her like alms. The next morning, on the train into the glass teeth of the city, Emma rehearsed what she would say at orientation. Professional, yet concise. Honest, without gratuitous explanation. She tugged the hem of her coat down, smoothed the denim that made her feel like herself, and clutched the bus ticket like a talisman. The city moved in a rush of faces and rain and muffled announcements. For once, she let herself be part of the tide instead of fighting it. Patricia Winters was waiting in the reception like an immovable sign. She led Emma through a maze of doors and card scanners, and finally into a room that smelled faintly of coffee and leather, where several people sat bent over screens. They handed Emma forms, direct deposit details, a non-disclosure agreement that had the smooth, cold weight of power. Somewhere distant, through glass, a piano-smoothed corner of the floor reflected the skyline. "You'll start on the events team," Patricia said, in that receptionist voice that measured warmth in protocol. "Mr. Reed wants someone he can trust on logistics for the gala. You'll be under Miss Ramirez for the first month, then you'll rotate through communications. We'll track performance and train accordingly." Emma signed lines with a pen that felt unfamiliar, the ink looping into jobs and wages and obligations. The payroll number seemed large, generous, not extravagant, but large enough that the rent and the specialist payments would become plausible. It felt like a promise in small print. Later, in a small office with plants that looked as if someone watered them with attention, she met Miss Ramirez, who ran a tight ship with a laugh that came out like a teacup being set down carefully. "We value competence over background," Miss Ramirez told her, having been briefed by Patricia, and smiled in a way that suggested she meant it. "We'll teach you the systems. We trust you to learn fast." Emma had always resented the phrase, "trust you to learn." People said it as if skill were simple, and the need to learn would not be taxing. She would learn. She would be reliable in a new kind of ledger. She would not be anyone's test subject. Through the glass of the corridor, she saw him only in glimpses. A silhouette at the end of a hall, a hand reaching for a door, the way his presence drew the room into a softer, more attentive hush. He moved through his company like someone walking a cathedral, the walls bearing the weight of decisions. When he spoke to staff, they turned. When he considered a question, the room waited. "She has a camera," Miss Ramirez said suddenly, without preamble. It was not a question. Emma blinked. "I used to." She stopped, because the camera was a delicate wound, a string of memory and hope. "I used to shoot, not professionally. I did a few freelance gigs, portraits, some street work." "Good," Miss Ramirez said. "We need someone who sees. Events are about framing and light as much as logistics. If you want, bring your camera to the gala. Not as an official photographer. No, that's a separate role. But we like people who understand composition." It felt like a small, unexpected allowance, a note that her old life might not die at the first paycheck. It also worried her. Would they exploit that? Would they ask her to work off the clock because she had a hobby? She promised herself to keep professional lines clear. She owed herself that as much as she owed her mother. Her first day ended with little fanfare. She left the building with a badge clipped to her coat that spelled out a new identity in block letters. Outside, the rain had stopped and the city breathed again. In the street, a man bumped into her. An umbrella jostled. She remembered the wallet in her pocket. No, not in her pocket. The wallet was on a clipboard in some reception bin now. How it had led her here like a thread. That night, she sat at the worn table and took inventory. Rent, bills, the medication jar with its small white pills. The paycheck made everything walkable in a new way. Appointment calls and better medicine, a second-hand camera lens she could save up for. But the ledger of indignity remained. She had traded one form of vulnerability for another. A week later, Emma learned that Reed sometimes walked the floors unannounced. People cleared their throats and prepared for him in small ways that made the office smell of rehearsed civility. When he stopped by Miss Ramirez's desk to ask about the gala, a simple question about seating arrangements, Emma felt her skin go alert. He looked at lists the way a person might look at a map, attentive to routes. He glanced at her, and this time the look was not the pinprick of curiosity in a crowd. It was a quiet, appraising thing that might be mistaken for interest if you were soft with hope. "You returned my wallet that day," he said when the corridor had thinned. It was not an accusation. It was an observation he made to people he intended to remember. "I did," Emma said. Her voice surprised her by not trembling. She had rehearsed both refusal and acceptance in the shower, in the dark, in the small pockets between chores. Both felt honest. He looked at her as if trying to place the sound of her voice in his memory. "You did it without telling anyone," he said. "You left a record, but you didn't take it upon yourself to announce what you'd done." "It was the right thing to do," she said plainly. "It was," he agreed, "and you didn't expect a reward." "I expected nothing," she said. "I expected rain." He let out a small, private laugh that did not reach his eyes. Most people expect nothing, and we measure them against expectations. He considered her for a long moment. I hope you'll keep your camera at the gala. When someone who commanded rooms asked for something harmless like a camera, it was tempting to collect it as a token. Emma said, "I will," and meant it. It felt like her small rebellion to be present and to look. As the gala approached, the foundation's rhythm accelerated. There were binders, sliding charts, donors who rehearsed their compliments. Patricia's smile sharpened into function as she coordinated seating charts like a general marshaling troops. Emma found herself running lists and carrying small, quiet things: a stack of programs, a donor's jacket to the cloakroom, a forgotten name tag with the luxury of ownership that came with being connected. She photographed rehearsals on a compact phone, the way a person takes illicit snapshots of a life they hope to belong to. People posed, laughed, their joy a thing that could be framed. She liked the way light landed on strangers' faces. It reminded her why she had once loved photography. The way it let her set the world in a slower focus and measure the distance between a person and their moment. One night, deep into the rearrangement of place cards and menu proofs, she overheard a conversation she could not avoid. Two directors, thin and late-night weary, spoke in the corner, voices small and sharp. Sarah was generous, one said, and the name landed like a bell. She left the foundation in better structures. I still can't believe what Julia did. Emma paused with the stack of name cards in her hand. She'd heard the name Sarah before, attached to a softer memory in the lobby, a photograph on the wall of a woman smiling, hair dark, eyes distant. She had not known she belonged to Reed's life. "What happened?" she asked before she could clamp down on curiosity, the journalist's muscle that never entirely left her. The director's voice dropped. "It was embezzlement, mostly. Julia and the former CFO siphoned funds. Julia was close to Sarah, worked under her. It broke him. Sarah, she died not long after. The grief was terrible." Emma felt the space of the office shift. The man at the center of the company, the man who had staged tests in the streets, had a wound. Loss sometimes ate through people and left edges sharp enough to justify cruel experiments. She kept her face even. "I'm sorry," she said. They turned back to their work, and Emma carried the cards as if they had weight beyond paper. Sarah's face on the wall looked like a picture of joy, and now the edges of that joy were stained with betrayal and grief. The fact lodged like a small stone. Reed's behavior, his tests, his curiosity, unrolled into a more complicated seam. He had not simply been a man curious about honesty. He carried private fissures that propelled him toward control. The gala came with a tenderness of its own, a glittering arrangement of light and obligation. Donors drifted through rooms lined with orchids, speechwriters flitted like precise moths. Emma moved between people with a clipboard and a lens, capturing candids in the interstices. An older donor laughing with a doctor, a mother wiping her face, the way a child clung to a stuffed animal. Her pictures were small acts of recording that made the evening both real and fragile. She found her focus in the margins, in the exchange between a volunteer and an anxious parent, in the tired but honest hands arranging a plate. Later, when the lights had softened and the work was done, Reed found her by the back stair. The city at night looked different from that vantage, lights like joints in a skeleton, the river a black ribbon. He moved with a gravity that softened when he spoke. "You were good tonight," he said. Emma blinked at the compliment, like someone unused to praise. "I tried," she said. He nodded. "You have an eye," he said. "You notice things others don't. It's useful in this work." "I notice people," she corrected. "I photograph people." He looked at her for a long instant, and then, unexpectedly, took a breath. "I apologize for the methods I used," he said. Dropping a wallet and watching is not the right way to understand someone. I can see that now. The corridor seemed to shrink. The words were heavy and specific and offered with the weight of a man making an unguarded choice. Emma's knee-jerk reflex was suspicion. Apologies from above sometimes arrived in the same breath as explanations that softened the offense. But his apology was not perfunctory. It had edges, admission, the uncomfortable grammar of someone naming their own mistake. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly, the question that folded into the air with no accusation, only curiosity. He looked at the skyline through the glass, the city's lights distant. "After Sarah," he paused, and for a second his composure cracked like a mirror. "After she died, I didn't trust people the way I used to. I wondered if goodness was a performance, if people saved themselves for the cameras or for appearances. I thought I could rebuild trust by measuring it. That was a bad choice." He turned his head to her, his eyes raw and immediate. "I'm sorry if I made you feel like a specimen." Emma thought of the wallet's neat bills and the strange way power shuffled lives into a room and made them answer. She thought of her mother's small hand on hers and the life of obligations she carried. "It made me angry," she said. "Being tested is not something you get to administer." "I know," he said. The word was a small, honest thing. "And I promise, not as a professional pledge, but as a person, I will not do that on purpose again. No more staged tests." The promise sounded like something heavier than an apology, a rethreading of intent. Emma wanted to accept it and hold to it as a condition of staying. She wanted to believe that people could change, that a man who could measure loss and grief could also recognize where he had been cruel. But she also held a ledger she had kept for herself. She would not trade the small muscle of sovereignty for relief. "Your apology is accepted," she said carefully, "but actions matter more than words." He nodded, and in his nod there was an agreement not only to the moral ledger, but to the practical. The gala would end. The city would keep its noise. The wallet would sit in some lost and found, its $2,000 a fact in a book. But something else had been set in motion the day Emma returned the wallet, a relationship of observation and accountability that would not be tidy. That night, as she fed her mother tea and looked at the small, precise print of the pay stub that would, at last, buy some breathing room, Emma felt something like the aftertaste of rain. The wallet had been a trigger. A man who had been hurt had tried to test the world, and had been met by a young woman who chose integrity not as a performance, but as a life habit. The consequences, practical and moral, had unfolded in a way that would not resolve itself overnight. She fell asleep imagining light through a lens, the way a world could be rearranged by what you chose to focus on. The city kept turning, indifferent yet full of small, consequential turns. And somewhere in the back of her mind, the ledger of what she owed to her mother balanced with what she would demand from a man who had offered her a job. It would not be simple, it would not be clean, but she had a camera in her bag and a pen that had signed new obligations. She would write the terms as she went. The next morning, the foundation's lobby felt like the hinge of a new life. Patricia greeted her with the same precise smile, but it softened at the edges. Ms. Ramirez clasped her hands like a small blessing and handed her a badge. Reed passed in the corridor, and their eyes met. No tests that day, only a recognition, like two ships acknowledging a shared current. Emma clipped the badge on, the metal cool against her collarbone, and stepped into the place where the consequence of one honest act would begin to unfold into months of work, conflict, and a fragile, earning trust. The first weeks folded into a rhythm that felt both foreign and steadily familiar. Mornings began with the same thin subway light and the same tightness in Emma's chest, an anticipation that was part dread and part an oddly soft, hopeful hunger. She learned the building's choreography, The scanner that chirped when her badge read, the polite but distant nod from interns who still kept a careful distance, the way coffee on the 12th floor tasted of meetings and philanthropy. She learned to carry lists the way other people carried prayer beads, one tick at a time. Patricia Winters remained an exacting presence, but the edges softened in small ways that mattered. She still polished protocols with the same precise smile, but she began to pass Emma notes that made the job less like trespass and more like training. A suggestion on file naming, an offhand tip about donor preferences, a folded reminder that human beings were more than their credentials. Patricia's guard was still up, her gatekeeping intact, but it was no longer for Emma an impregnable wall. It was a door that opened when you learned how to knock. At first, the work was logistics and lists, confirmations, table assignments, the domestic minutiae of events that made donors feel seen. Emma moved through it with the same study competence she had brought to caring for her mother, meticulous, careful, unobtrusive. She proved herself not by grand gestures, but by doing the small things well. When a last-minute seating change threatened to cascade into offense, she tracked donors and swapped plates with a nimbleness that left people none the wiser and the evening intact. When a speaker's teleprompter glitched, she delivered a note with the exact line the staffer needed to steady a fraying cadence. Her reputation grew in quiet increments. She kept her camera close. Ms. Ramirez had been true to her word. The camera could come to the gala. That night was the pivot. Through the lens, Emma found the permission to look without expectation. Donors and volunteers who had been ivory-sheathed and cautious loosened under her attention. She caught a nurse's exhausted smile at a banquet table, an exhausted mother's hand on a child's back, the small, certain kindnesses that kept people moving. Her photos were not glossy, they were honest, rooted in a tenderness that made the foundation's work look human where press releases so often made it grand. Someone forwarded a set to the communications office. A few were used in a newsletter. The copywriter labeled them real in an email, as if that word had weight enough to be currency. Reed noticed. He noticed the way she framed hands rather than faces, the way she lingered on unvarnished details and made them meaningful. He brought the photos to the weekly meeting. No flourish, no fanfare, handing the printed contact sheet to Ms. Ramirez with an understated look. The room, used to charts and projections, looked at the small prints and shifted a little. People spoke more carefully after that. A week later, on a glass corridor that caught the afternoon light and split it, Reed stopped her. He did not call her into a formal office. He asked if she had a minute. And when a man who usually moved like a lined ledger asks, you learn not to waste time. He led her to a small room where a sofa sat under a window and sunlight drew a code in the carpet. "Your photographs," he began, true to his habit of beginning sentences as if he were placing a stone, "they caught something of the work that we haven't been able to explain in memos. There's a humanity there." Emma's reflex was to minimize. I take what's honest." "You take what's honest," he repeated, as if accepting the grammar as a fact. Then, unexpectedly, he reached into his coat and drew out a small box wrapped in heavy paper. It was too deliberate to be merely casual. He placed it on the table between them and watched her with an attention that was neither clinical nor cold. It was careful. "For the work," he said, "I'd like you to have this. Consider it an investment, not charity." She stared at the box as if it might be a test. Her hands were steady when she took it. Her thumb brushed the tape, and beneath her skin something like a memory tightened. Inside was a camera, a mid-level professional body, light and warm from the store it had come from. It was new in the way new things are, a promise shaped in plastic and glass. Her throat tightened. Accepting would make the jump from hobbyist to professional easier. It would give her tools, legitimacy, the capability to answer calls for assignments without borrowing equipment. Refusing would be a statement, a declaration of self-sufficiency. But refusal felt petulant in the face of practical needs. She thought of the specialist appointments she could book more reliably, the medication she could keep in a full jar. "You don't have to," she heard herself say, because a man who staged tests sometimes bought good things to soothe the conscience. He looked at her as if to measure whether she was asking for a condition. "I don't want this to be charity," he said. "I want it to be audited labor. Take it, and we will set a role. Paid assignments for the foundation. You will be compensated for photography work on a per-assignment basis, in addition to your salary. We'll list it on your contract." She wanted terms in ink, not promises in breath. "I'll accept if it's on the record," she said. "If it's paid work and not just, 'cause I'm already here, I'll pick up extra tasks. If it's on paper." He inclined his head. On paper. The camera became in her hands a kind of tool and a pact. She carried it home with the same taste she carried anything that mattered, cautious, grateful, and wary. That night, under the thin light of the kitchen, she cleaned it like one cleans a small temple, and thought of lenses as ways to open windows into things she wanted to make honest. Around the same time, Reed made other moves. He did what apologies must sometimes be required to make them credible. He made them visible. At a staff meeting, one that had been scheduled long before their exchange, he stood and owned the tests he had ordered. The Foundation's morning light seemed to attend his words. People who had been wary turned their heads to listen. He did not mince the causes. He spoke of grief and distrust, of the temptation to manufacture evidence for the sake of certainty. He apologized without hedging and, crucially, outlined change. "We stopped an unethical practice," he said plainly. "I am responsible. It will not happen again. I am commissioning an independent review of our hiring and donor engagement methods. We will convene an ethics advisory panel, and those policies will be written, published internally, and enforced." The words landed and then demanded proof. Reed offered proof. An independent committee was formed, composed of outside ethicists and community representatives. The Foundation committed to transparent hiring practices, and former subjects of tests, people who had been approached under false pretenses, were to receive compensation or a dignified explanation where appropriate. Patricia, listening, kept her expression measured. Some staff members murmured relief, others were skeptical. The audit, Reed said, would not be performed by insiders whose judgment might be impaired by loyalty. Emma watched the exchange with a practical eye. Policies could be drawn up, people could be sanctioned, change could be made official. But she also knew that the smallest actions were often the truest test. A promise kept in the break room, a hiring manager who refused to pull an old study out for convenience. The good in words needed the muscle of habit to endure. Her assignments multiplied. What had been occasional photography tasks became regular documentation, home visits with clinicians, portraits of families receiving support, environments that needed to be seen in order to be believed. She learned to make fast decisions about light, about what to include, about what to keep sacred, and what to show. She wrote captions carefully, aware that a single line could turn a person into a statistic. Her photographs began to change more than brochures. They shaped grant narratives and helped funders see the human faces behind proposals. When donors read the newsletters, they were more likely to fund a program if they could imagine the people whose lives would be touched. The money was real. It allowed for small but seismic practicalities. A specialist appointment with a neurologist whose waiting list she could now buy through an initial consultation fee, an extra inhaler her mother would no longer have to ration, a modest shared apartment with better ventilation that reduced the nights when her mother's cough turned thin and metallic. Emma did not pretend these changes erased long-standing inequalities. They made the fight more bearable, gave oxygen to hope, rather than converting it into the miracle she could not promise. There were tensions, too. Not everyone welcomed her presence. A few colleagues assumed she would be grateful for anything and therefore amenable to working unpaid at odd hours. She corrected them with quiet firmness. She insisted on contracts when photo work came in, on time, and pay for extra hours. Those demands sometimes ruffled feathers, but they earned respect. Her stipulations were never about entitlement, they were about dignity. The foundation learned quickly that she was not a person to be pressed into free labor. 6 months unfolded as a montage of small victories and measured hardships. She signed checks that steadied the household ledger, a rent increase paid, the specialist's intake covered, a modest savings account opened in a cautious corner. Her mother's health improved enough to move from makeshift oxygen support to a regimented treatment plan that required travel but extended clarity. On a damp afternoon, the two of them moved into a modest fourth-floor walk-up that had a window with a view of the river. Not a cure, not a guarantee, but a room that allowed the light to fall differently across the bed. Her mother painted the thermostat numbers with a steady hand, making the apartment a home rather than a temporary shelter. Professionally, Emma's responsibilities deepened in ways that matched her skills. She became the Foundation's Community Documentation Coordinator, a title that carried a modest bump in salary and a new set of obligations. She oversaw volunteer photographers, coordinated field visits, and managed a small budget for equipment and travel. Miss Ramirez advocated for her at meetings. Patricia offered pointers on donor relations. Reed began to consult her as a peer on how certain imagery might look to families. The lines between employee and partner softened as Emma's role was defined by contribution rather than reward. There were moments that tested them both. At a board retreat, a donor asked if the Foundation's field materials could be standardized, essentially requesting images that would make suffering more palatable for giving. Emma pushed back. "People aren't props," she said quietly to the room. "They're partners. The way we photograph should reflect their agency, not exploit their situation." Her language was not grandstanding. It was a necessary correction. Reed supported her. He offered a policy. Every family photographed for a narrative campaign would have input on how they were portrayed and receive copies of images and modest compensation. It was not a perfect solution, but it was repair, one that acknowledged power and attempted to balance it. The wound of betrayal, Sarah's death and Julia's embezzlement, remained part of the Foundation's texture. At a memorial service on an autumn afternoon, Reed gave a speech that was less controlled and more human than Emma had ever heard him be in public. He spoke of Sarah not as a name on a plaque, but as a person who had devoted years to the idea that money could heal only when paired with accountability. He named Julia's betrayal plainly, without malice, acknowledging that the theft had been a wound not only to the Foundation's bank accounts, but to its trust. The speech ended with Reed announcing a new fund, seeded from the Foundation's reserves and matched by his own contribution, dedicated to research into the disease that had taken Sarah and into ways that clinics could better serve patients of limited means. The fund also included a mandate for oversight and transparency. Emma photographed the event. From behind the lens, she watched Reed as he spoke, and for the first time, she saw how grief had been both a shaper and a distorting force. He had been hurt into methods that were harmful. He was now attempting to be hurt into methods that might be reparative. That did not change the past, but it changed the force with which he sought to move forward. Their personal communications changed too. Small, deliberate moves toward a parity that respect demanded. He stopped asking offhand questions about her life in a tone that implied research and started asking in ways that asked for consent. Conversations that had once been one-sided became mutual. He began to seek her counsel on which neighborhoods the Foundation might support for grants, in a way that suggested he trusted her intimate knowledge of the city. She learned his language, the precise weights he used to talk about projects, and he learned some of hers, the shorthand of exposure, of aperture and framing, of looking at a person through the generosity of attention. There were moments of friction. Once, when a vendor mischaracterized a family in promotional text, Emma confronted the writer. She was blunt and relentless about integrity. The writer pushed back. Reed intervened, not to silence, but to enforce the ethical line. He sided with Emma publicly, calling for a retraction and a public correction. Those small acts of support mattered more than grand declarations. They changed how the office perceived her and how she felt in it. The balance of power shifted incrementally over months, each respectful act stacking into new norms. As months passed, the camera became an extension of her voice. She produced a short photographic series for the Foundation's web campaign, capturing families and clinicians in modes that emphasized agency, hands-on charts, doctors listening, children at play in hospital corridors. The series quieted critics and drove community engagement. Communities began to request the Foundation's help not merely as recipients, but as partners in projects. One small clinic invited Emma to run a short workshop with staff and parents on documenting impact ethically. She traveled with a small bag and the professional body Reed had given her, and she listened to people, explain their needs in language that wasn't always jargon. She taught them to photograph the things that mattered to them, to own the narrative of their lives. Her mother watched the slow change with a guarded pride. "You look less tired," her mother said one evening as they ate warmed soup. "You used to come home with your shoulders rounded like you were carrying the whole city." Her hand corrected the line of Emma's shirt in a motherly gesture. "This job suits you." "It's not just a job," Emma said. "It's tools. I can use the money to make choices that keep us afloat." "And you're careful," her mother added. "Don't let anyone tell you you owe them because they gave you a ladder. You climbed it." Emma smiled. The ladder had been found and then chosen. It was not a gift that erased responsibilities. It was a route she had to walk with eyes open. Months later, a situation arose that would test Reed's commitment to change publicly. A journalist ran an investigative piece resurrecting the old tests, detailing several incidents where wallets had been purposely dropped in neighborhoods and people's reactions recorded. The article quoted anonymous sources and raised ethical questions about the Foundation's methods. The Foundation's inbox swelled. Donors demanded answers. The board convened an emergency meeting. The old specter of experiment threatened to unravel the new trust. Reed did not retreat. He held a press briefing and, in a voice that had been shaped by the long months, took responsibility again, but this time with specific, actionable remediation. He outlined the independent audit's preliminary findings, announced the immediate termination of any staff implicated in ordering covert tests, and publicly committed to a new hiring practice. All positions would be posted with transparent criteria, and candidates would be selected through panels that included community representatives. He pledged to make amends where harm had been done and to create a public report on past methods. Emma watched the papers cover the press briefing and felt the tremor of possibility, that people in power could be held to account and might choose to act differently. In a private moment after the media bite had settled, Reed asked to meet with her in the same small room where he had once placed the camera box. "I set a poor example," he said without preamble. "I thought I could quantify human choices and use that data to decide who deserved resources. That was arrogant and wrong. You called me out then, and I meant my apology. Now I have to make the work match the words." "You did some right things," Emma said. "You created policy. You funded an audit. But words take time to be true." He nodded. "Then let this be an opportunity to prove it. I want you to be part of how we do that. I want your voice on the ethics panel, not as a token, but as someone who knows the city and knows how to see people fairly." Her reaction was almost reflexive. She could refuse, she could accept. To accept would mean work on uncomfortable terrain, official meetings, cross-examinations, the politics of reform. To refuse would be to step away from the ability to influence change. She thought of the family she had photographed, of the way a single image had altered a donor's view enough to fund a clinic's expansion. She thought of the ledger she kept at home, Competence, responsibility, the habit of care. She nodded. "I'll do it," she said, "but on 2 conditions. Name them. No more tests, public policy, explicit, written, and any community we engage will get a seat at the decision table about how we present work that involves them." He exhaled, and in that breath there was relief and a steady seriousness. "No more tests," he repeated, the phrase now translating into a procedural reality. "And community participation in narrative decisions." Agreed. They walked out of the small room into the corridor that had watched the first awkwardness between them and felt something like a reset. The foundation slowly, imperfectly, started to be what it had promised to be on paper. Not suddenly, not perfectly, but in the way long-term trust accrues, through repeated small commitments kept. As months moved toward a year since the wallet on 7th, Emma found herself increasingly at the heart of the Foundation's outreach. She negotiated a project that paired the Foundation's grant-making with a photography fellowship for community storytellers. The fellowship provided modest stipends, cameras, and training, and asked that communities lead the storytelling. Emma designed the curriculum, went into neighborhoods, taught workshops, and helped distribute equipment. She watched people stare at themselves in a way that suggested they were no longer background props, but authors of their own images. The fellowship's pilot project produced a short gallery show that toured clinics and community centers and raised both awareness and funds. Reed attended the opening. He stood in a corner, like someone who had learned to let light fall first where it needed to, letting the room's attention find itself. When Emma's work was explained at the podium, he listened. After the event, he found her by the gallery wall, where a photograph of a child at a clinic, mid-laugh, cheek slit, hung under soft light. "You did this," he said simply. "We did this," she corrected, because the fellowship had been a collaboration. He smiled, brief and private, and for a moment the years between them seemed like distance crossed carefully, rather than an accidental bridge. He asked her to a meeting the next day with the board and offered her a new title, Director of Community Documentation. It came with responsibility, a seat at strategy meetings, and a salary that would allow her mother a more secure health plan and a small buffer for emergencies. The offer was generous and recognized the work she had done. But it also meant moving from a role that began as assistant to one with authority, and that had consequences for the office's power dynamics. Emma negotiated. She insisted on terms that mattered beyond pay, a clause in her contract that guaranteed her autonomy over community narratives, a commitment that any photography projects involving community members would carry compensation, and, most importantly, a clause that banned any covert tests, with a system for reporting and addressing grievances. She also insisted on a commitment to maintain her schedule, so caregiving responsibilities would remain manageable. It was a negotiation rooted in lived reality. She would not trade the precariousness of her mother's care for careerism. The board signed. It was not a fairy tale. There were still meetings where she argued hard, where older voices asked if she had the experience for certain asks, where the dynamics of class and power whispered in corners. There were nights she returned home exhausted, feet sore, fingers ink-stained from editing captions until the light went thin. But the work had meaning, and the Foundation's policies had shifted through her involvement. On a cold morning that carried the metallic promise of winter, Reed called her into his office. The skyline outside his glass wall was civic and sharp, the river a slice of pewter. He closed the door behind them and sat across from her, hands folded. "I owe you more than a camera," he began. "You've held this place accountable when I failed to do so. You've taken what could have been a wound and made it into work that heals. I want to make a formal acknowledgement of that and an offer." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were proposals, a long-term collaboration. She would lead community documentation with a team, an independent budget, and decision-making autonomy. He asked if she would co-create a public ethics charter for the foundation, which would include a clause prohibiting any future covert human experiments, an enforcement mechanism, and a community oversight component. He wanted her signature, not his alone. The folder also included a small personal note. No flourish, just an honest sentence about how her steadiness had meant more than he could say in public. Emma read the proposals. It was the concrete repair she had asked for in many small ways. She had wanted an organization that did not merely apologize, but structurally changed. Here it was, messy and bureaucratic and utterly necessary. She thought of the wallet again, the $2,000, the way a small item had ricocheted into everything that followed. She thought of the nights counting bills, of her mother's cough, of the camera's weight in her hands. She placed the folder down and looked at him. "I will sign," she said, "but there's one last term I want to add." "Name it." "No more tests." Not just a promise to staff, a public, contractual clause. If someone uses deception to study people in our name, there are consequences. He did not flinch. He nodded, and the motion felt like release and accountability combined. "No more tests," he agreed, and reached for a pen. He signed where his line should be and pushed the pen across to her. She thought of the ledger she kept for herself and for her mother. The pen in that moment felt like one more instrument in the small, stubborn work of justice. She added her signature and the clause. As she did, she felt the margin between them shrink to something human and exact, two professionals binding themselves to an ethical practice. They stood and shook hands. The gesture was not merely ceremonial. It was a contract, a recognition, and a mutual pledge. Around the handshake, there was no flourish of romance, no leap across a power imbalance. There was a mutual commitment to the work and to doing it with integrity. It felt satisfying, in a way that romance would have complicated then. Honor, mutuality, respect. Romance, if it came, would have to wait until parity was not just policy, but lived reality. Outside, the city went on its ceaseless business, oblivious to the small agreements forged in a high office. Emma returned to her desk with a renewed sense of purpose. She walked past the lost and found where the wallet had once sat and, on an impulse, asked for it back. The receptionist looked surprised and fetched the bin. The wallet was still there, its leather softened by time, the brass zip dulled by use. $2,000 was long gone into the channels of Reed's life, but the object remained. It had become a relic of the choice that had started things. She held it in her hand for a long time, fingers tracing the lines in the leather. There was a small satisfaction in reclaiming the object that had set the sequence in motion, a quiet reclaiming of narrative. She closed it and slid it into a drawer where it could live as a reminder, a memento of a moment when integrity met opportunity, and neither was easy. The camera sat on her desk like a companion. She took it out most days, to clinics, to community centers, to small homes where people agreed to be seen on their terms. Once, she set up an exhibition of the fellowship's photographs in a community center and watched people walk through, recognizing themselves in frames made by neighbors. She watched donors stand quietly and read captions that had been co-written with the people they pictured. Money followed images sometimes, but the images were now, by design, not of people as charity cases, but of people as partners. Slowly, subtly, the foundation's language changed. Where there had been press releases about recipients, there were now stories about collaborators. Where the board once met behind closed doors, it opened certain sessions to community members. Reed created a small emergency fund for people the foundation had previously tested and ensured that any person who might have been affected by earlier experiments would receive a personal explanation and compensation if harmed. None of these moves repaired every wound at once, but they were stitches that took time and care. Their relationship, Reed's and Emma's, was not a love story in the immediate sense. It was a narrative of mutual respect and cautious closeness. They spent long hours in meetings with staff and with community partners. They argued about captions and budgets, sometimes with heat, but always returning to the work. There were moments when they shared coffee and silence, and those silences began to feel like a language between them. Once, when a winter storm hit and the office emptied, they stayed to finalize a campaign's rollout. They walked down the stairwell together under fluorescence, their conversation small and ordinary. Reed told her a memory of Sarah, how she had insisted that every photograph had to include someone who looked angry sometimes, because life was not all sweetness. Emma laughed softly, an acknowledgement of the complexity of memory. Months later, in a quiet corridor after a board meeting, Reed offered another small, human act of apology. He asked if there was anything he could do personally to make amends beyond policy. She thought of the community fellows who had been denied opportunities due to the foundation's earlier missteps, of families who had been photographed without adequate consent, of people who felt they had been treated as experiments. None of these moves repaired every wound at once, but they were stitches that took time and care. Their relationship, Reed's and Emma's, was not a love story in the immediate sense. It was a narrative of mutual respect and cautious closeness. They spent long hours in meetings with staff and with community partners. They argued about captions and budgets, sometimes with heat, but always returning to the work. There were moments when they shared coffee and silence, and those silences began to feel like a language between them. Once, when a winter storm hit and the office emptied, they stayed to finalize a campaign's rollout. They walked down the stairwell together under fluorescence, their conversation small and ordinary. Reed told her a memory of Sarah, how she had insisted that every photograph had to include someone who looked angry sometimes, because life was not all sweetness. Emma laughed softly, an acknowledgement of the complexity of memory. Months later, in a quiet corridor after a board meeting, Reed offered another small, human act of apology. He asked if there was anything he could do personally to make amends beyond policy. She thought of the community fellows who had been denied opportunities due to the foundation's earlier missteps, of families who had been photographed without adequate consent, of people who felt they had been treated as experiments. She asked for a scholarship fund in Sarah's name that would provide equipment and training for youth-led photo projects in underserved neighborhoods, small grants to keep cameras in hands that otherwise might not have them. He agreed and funded it personally, insisting on oversight to ensure it reached communities directly. The scholarship bore Sarah's name and folded repair into a future. At the inaugural ceremony, a young photographer, one of the program's first fellows, made a speech about how having a camera had changed his life. He spoke about agency and being seen accurately. Emma stood in the back, the camera at her side, and watched as the room recognized that the work's center had shifted. On the night the fellowship's first catalog printed, Emma sat with her mother on their small couch and flipped through the photographs. The pages smelled faintly of ink and possibility. Her mother ran a thumb along a portrait of a child studying by lamplight. "You look tired," her mother said softly, but there was pride in the line of her mouth. "You look like you did when you first learned to shoot, focused." "It's been a lot," Emma admitted. "It's worth it," her mother said simply. The words were not a cure. They were instead a steadying hand. There remained, always, the knowledge that the wallet that had started everything could not be the model for meaningful change in general. Not everyone who returned a lost item would be given a job by a billionaire, nor should that be the recipe for justice. That had been Emma's quiet insistence from the beginning. Dignity should not be conditional upon being noticed by someone powerful. What happened next, policy, repair, fellowship, had to be structural so that ordinary people who did everyday acts of integrity were not left to the luck of being observed. When Reed proposed formal partnership, an idea that he introduced not as a romantic offer but as a professional proposition, Emma listened. He wanted to create a long-term program blending philanthropy and community storytelling where she would have equal footing in decision-making. The word partnership, in his usage, was about shared governance and shared accountability. She studied the documents. They were dense in good ways and bureaucratic in others. It was a partnership that would remove hierarchical ambiguity and make collaboration a contractual reality. She signed on with the same sense of care she had brought to every other contract, terms read, assurances negotiated, and ethical code front and center. When they formalized the partnership in a small office lined with books and framed photographs from community fellows, from the foundation staff, Reed closed a folder and looked at her. "We will not test people again," he said, "not in any form. If we ever fall short, you have my permission to call it out publicly." "You have my permission to do the same," she replied. They shook hands. The gesture was deliberate and mutual, like the earlier handshake that had followed the contract. This one felt different. It carried the weight of months, of work done, of promises kept, and systems changed. It was a partnership of equals in practice, if not in biography. It did not erase the beginning, the wallet, the rain, the $2,000, but it translated it into something that would not be replicated as a model of power. The wallet rested in the drawer on Emma's desk for a while longer. Occasionally, she would take it out and touch the leather, feeling the grain and the small dark marks. One afternoon, she placed the camera on top of it and shut the drawer. The juxtaposition felt right. An object that had tested the world closed away, a tool that let people tell their own stories safe in the light. The last scene, quiet and exact, found Emma on the foundation's roof in early spring. The city spread below like a map of the life she had once only watched. Reed joined her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without pretense. The air smelled sharp with thaw. They stood watching the light change on glass and river. "You did not become someone else when you came here," Reed said. "You kept your standards." "You gave me a camera," she said, half properties list, half gratitude. "And you made it mean something," he replied. She set the cup down and reached into her bag, pulling out a small print from a recent assignment, a photograph of her mother laughing with a nurse who had learned to listen. It was the kind of image that could not be staged. She handed it to him. He took it and studied it as if he were seeing someone's soul mirrored in paper. "Thank you," he said simply. Words had become less easy for him, but they were more authentic now. Emma tucked the print back into her pocket. She thought of the ledger she kept, an internal accounting of what she owed herself and others. She thought of the line she had insisted upon months earlier, and how that line now sat in contracts and policies. The world had not become fairer overnight. Poverty still belonged to systems that needed large-scale fixes. But within this small orbit, within the decision-making of a foundation that mattered to many, a pattern had shifted. Policies had been rewritten. Opportunities had been created that did not hinge on being an object of someone's curiosity. They did not speak of romance. There was perhaps something tender in the pause between them, a mutual warmth that might grow over years into something more, or might remain as the deep regard of 2 people who had rebuilt a workplace. For now, they had work to do, people to support, and an ethics charter to implement. The personal would come in its own time, if it came at all, and it would have to be earned just as the rest had been. As she left the roof and walked back into the life they were building, Emma felt less like a person who had been given a ladder and more like someone who had been handed tools and a seat at the table. Her mother's breathing that night was regular and less ragged. The specialist had adjusted medication with a dose that finally seemed to settle. The small apartment by the river held less fear in the corners. Emma put the camera on the kitchen counter and sat with her mother, listening to the city hum like a distant pulse. The wallet's presence in a drawer, the camera at hand, the signed clause in her contract, these were the artifacts of a consequential choice. What happened when a poor girl returned a billionaire's lost wallet was not a tidy fairy tale. It opened a complicated door. It made Reed face his methods and sparked institutional change. It gave Emma practical means to care for her mother and to reclaim her vocation. It required vigilance, negotiation, and ethical labor. It produced a partnership, professional, reparative, and, in time, possibly something deeper, built on mutual accountability rather than unilateral power. She slept that night with the camera on the bedside table, the lens cap off like a small candle. In dreams, she framed light, practiced the economy of breath, and woke with the knowledge that one act of honesty had started a sequence where her agency mattered at every turn. The world had not been redeemed, but a foundation, and a man who had caused harm, had been banked into a new set of promises with her at the center of their telling. If this story moved you, consider liking and subscribing to follow more character-driven stories like Emma's. There are more lives that turn when choices are made, and sometimes they ripple farther than we expect.